Welcome back to another edition of Church and State with Christopher Farrar and Brian McCall. We have two interestingly related stories this week, all about the gender confusion of our modern world. Who would have thought even 50 years ago that we'd be where we are now, Chris? Where nobody would even know what a man or a woman is. Would anybody have predicted that?
Well, it's the end result of the rebellion against the divine order. I mean, you've written about this more than anybody. The eternal law. Even a
Right.
pop song recognizes the eternal law. That's the way God wants it. That's the way God planned it to be. Meaning the created order of all things, the operation of the laws of the universe, the natural law. All of this is laid down by divine decree, and it's a rebellion against that. So essentially, it's a war against being. There is no such thing as two genders. God did not create them man and woman. And we don't have to listen to these divine categories because for us they don't exist. And this is the end result. You have men swimming on the girls' swim team, and
Exactly.
and the girls' feeble protests will go unanswered. So yeah, that's it. It's end stage rebellion against the divine order.
Well, and it's worse than just men competing against women in weightlifting or whatever. Here's a story that the Epoch Times broke earlier, actually last month, the end of January. A Mr. James Tubbs was recently arrested and convicted for molesting a young girl. I think she might have only been 10 years old or so, sexually molesting her in a school bathroom. Now, at the time Mr. Tubbs did this, he was 17. He's now 26. But thanks to some DNA evidence, they were able to link him to the crime, and he was brought in by the police again. And interestingly, as soon as he's brought into custody, Mr. James Tubbs all of a sudden decides that he's no longer Mr. James Tubbs. In fact, he's just decided the moment he's arrested, he's Hannah Tubbs, and he's a woman. So the prosecutor in the case, the LA District Attorney, George Gascon, uh,
Wasn't he funded by Soros?
uh,
His
yes, he was
election
one of
was
those
yeah,
DAs funded by Soros.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
George, I almost called him Gaston from the Beauty and the Beast, but no, George Gascon. He decided, oh, you're a woman, no problem. So first he made two decisions. We'll talk. He first decided to try him as a minor, even though he's 26 now, because he was 17 at the time, and then decided, it seems the courts agreed, to say once he was convicted, okay, now you got to serve out your sentence, I think a couple of years, in a juvenile, female only facility, because now you're Hannah. So again, just to recap where we are now, a convicted man who molested a girl is now being incarcerated with juvenile girls. And in fact, the Epoch Times points out he's not undergone any of these disgusting mutilation surgeries. So let's just say he has all of his equipment to potentially impregnate even a girl. I mean, is
What
this
has
something
he
that
what has he done to uh, lend credibility to his preposterous claim that he's now a woman? Has he taken any hormones? Has he done anything at all other than to declare himself a woman?
according to the report, just decided the moment he was taken into custody. Oh, by the way, don't call me that. My name's Hannah now. I've just
I have a
decided I'm a
solution.
woman.
I
Yes.
have a solution. All of the inmates in that female juvenile prison should declare themselves men. That way, it would be inappropriate for him to remain there.
And again, I mean, is this really the law? I mean, could this really be the law in our country that this guy could be put in? I mean, it's kind of like you have a kid that robs a candy store. Your punishment is we're going to lock you in the candy store for a year.
Well,
I mean,
again, it's the final stage of this rebellion against God, and it shows the darkening of reason that comes with the loss of grace. And the loss of grace isn't just an individual phenomenon. When many people lose grace, we're all sinners. We all need to be reconciled to God. If we refuse reconciliation, if we're not in a state of grace, the reason becomes darkened. And when so many people are in that state, institutionalized unreason becomes the norm. And then it just degenerates into total insanity, which is what we're seeing now.
hmm.
This is just sheer lunacy. It doesn't make any sense. It can't be defended, and yet people feel intimidated into going along with it because the only guide star now is media generated public opinion. And if you buck that, it's worse than bucking the magisterium of the Catholic Church because this is the secular magisterium. You must bow to the secular magisterium. We see that with poor Joe Rogan, by the way, who was, you know,
Yes.
hurriedly stepping back from daring to have pronounced true what the media were calling false until they decided it was true. And
Right.
someone made a funny comment about the fact checkers with their ridiculous fact checks that turn out to be false. That they have a designation that they should call false for now, because
False for now. False for now. Well, actually, I actually saw on CNN a clip where they basically admitted their fact checking was they did a Google search.
yeah, there is no fact. That's politicized, and everything's
Yes.
politicized, and the politicization of society, which is always a leftward drift, because again, there's loss of grace. No one is following the divine plan any longer. That's enforced by the legacy media. You have a few lone voices crying out in the wilderness, and like the Epic Times. I love the way they say that something like Gateway Pundit is a fount of misinformation.
Right.
When we had when the legacy media had been lying to us 24/7 about everything all of the time. There's just no truth any longer. In fact, they've achieved 100% reliability in the sense that if you believe the opposite of what the legacy media are telling you, you know you're on the right track. So
Right.
in that sense, inversely, they're 100% reliable. But the Gateway Pundit, for example, was breaking all of these stories and are now even accepted by the legacy media 2 years in regarding the COVID problem. So this
Mm.
is what we see. This is why we're people are accepting of this, or at least are obliged to exhibit external conformity to this narrative that there are no fixed genders, and
Mm.
that this loathsome criminal can simply declare himself a woman and get a nice cushy cell in a female juvenile detention facility.
So, and this here is this LADA, which is an elected position, as you pointed out, which is one of those. There was a big effort of Soros and some other big funders of the radical Marxist revolution to specifically get DAs elected. So, if you're in LA, when next time his term comes up, remember what he just did. But is this like a kooky California anomaly? Do you think, or is this something that could happen in other states in our country?
Oh,
Is this
it will happen in other states, but it will happen like the pandemic restrictions amounting to house arrest for dictatorships. It will happen in blue states. And I've noted this in an
Mhm.
article I did for the Remnant. This whole idea of the deadly pandemic that requires the most extreme measures restricting human freedoms somehow does not seem to operate when you leave a jurisdiction controlled by Democrats. And I noted that in Florida, even within the state of Florida, which is controlled by Republicans and Governor
Yep.
DeSantis, the subdivisions controlled by Democrats refuse to go along with the liberation of the people. They intend
Mhm.
to keep masks on children, and they intend to have vaccine mandates at private businesses. So it's a pernicious phenomenon related to the Democrats, and the Democrats are really the plague here because
Mhm.
they are the vanguard of social and moral degeneracy in this country. The end stage deterioration in social order that I'm talking about is a phenomenon driven by the political left and their legacy media spokespeople.
Well, even in your home state there, Virginia, you had your new governor sworn in, and one of his first couple of acts was to try to unravel the branch Covidian religion that had been enacted into law there, and for example, forbade schools to require masks. But I see, school there, same thing. Local school districts and subdivisions are just saying, ah, forget it. We're not following that. We're not going to
Yeah,
do it.
they're going to force little children down to the age of 3 in preschool or even 2 to have these muzzles on their faces all day long, which even the CNN medical analysts recently admitted are nothing more than facial decorations.
Mm,
2 years in, they finally let us know what we knew all along, that these cloth masks are absolutely useless. But they do have a use. It's a symbol of conformity and submission to the agenda of the revolutionaries. The COVID virus is part of this revolution, which includes, even in Virginia, the idea that there's no fixed gender. So we have that incident in Loudoun County
yeah.
where the boy identifying as a woman committed sexual assault. I believe it was in the locker room, and the school district covered it up.
Hmm.
Youngkin is investigating what Loudoun County did.
Mm,
And I think that juvenile offender got a very light sentence. He was ultimately convicted. I forget what the sentence was, but it was ridiculously light
mm.
for serial rape. It was at least 2 victims of this character
Yes.
declared himself a woman. So it's happening even in Virginia. But again, it's happening within the subdivisions controlled by the radical left, Loudoun County being one of them. There's only so much Youngkin can do other than sending in the National Guard. If I were him, here's what I would propose. If you're watching, Governor, listen to this proposal. You have state police. I would dispatch state police, a contingent to every school in every school district that is refusing to let children be freed from the masks, to escort the children in and insist that the school authorities leave them alone.
Hmm. Well,
With a police escort, they may be able to get inside the school without their muzzles on.
right. Well, interestingly, I mean, many people are talking about, are we headed to civil war? Are we headed to secession? I mean, in certain ways, these stories say to me, I think we're already there. I mean, we're not we're already in that state when you have an order by a governor of a state, be it Florida, Virginia, these examples. So here's the law, and then you have people just saying, well, sorry, we're doing our own thing, or the various states, or you have a president of the United States announcing, I'm going to do something that I know is illegal, extending the eviction moratorium, and then almost every time something's done, half the states or 17 states or 20 states sue, saying we're not going to follow your law. I mean, we really are kind of a de facto divided country, but divided just right down. I mean, right across states and even within states.
Yeah, which shows that the pandemic is completely illusory. It all depends upon who's controlling the politics of a given area. Outside of these areas, there is no pandemic. People have just gone on with their lives, as is the case in Florida. But don't step into a Democrat-controlled city or a Democrat-controlled county because suddenly the pandemic returns. It's nonsense. Yeah, so there is an internal division in the country, but there's never going to be a civil war again. You know why? The feds have all the guns.
Right.
The little citizen militia with their AK-47s and their shotguns, what are they going to do against tanks?
And Patriot missiles, right?
And Patriot missiles.
Yes,
and drone strikes. The drone strikes alone will stop. There's no possibility, not that I'm advocating it, there's no possibility of a violent secession along the lines of the Civil War when both sides had the same level of armaments. And the only reason the South lost is that they were outnumbered and didn't have the industrial capacity. It's never going to happen.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you in that sense of the Civil War of the 1860s, but in the same sense that there really are. I mean, we're almost living as two different countries. I mean, that phenomenon is the same. So not a shooting war, but really a war, because I think as you started, we're at war with the natural law and with God. When we do things like this and say, basically, we refuse reality, like, okay, you want to become Hannah? You're Hannah. I mean, how can we not but be at war with ourselves when we're at war with God?
Well, if there is no God, there is no reality. Everything is subject to evolution. There are no fixed natures or essences of anything because there's no creator. So you can be or do whatever you please, regardless of what appears to be your divinely ordained constitution as a man or a woman. And of course, right and wrong go out the window as well. They become totally irrelevant. Because the standard is not what God has ordained. What is actually inscribed in you is the natural law. It's written on your heart. That doesn't matter because there is no God. Nothing was inscribed on the heart. You just do whatever you please. Of course, conservatives can't do whatever they please because this is what Leo predicted. When you allow truth and error to contend for dominance, error will prevail and the truth will be persecuted. And that will lead, to use Leo's phrase, to final disaster. And this is it. We're in the middle of final disaster. There's a chance for some reversal in the next election. Trump's election was a kind of political miracle that brought about a reversal. And by the way, there's no doubt that election was stolen, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, mail-in ballots, ballot harvesting, faxed ballots, no chain of custody. And the margins were so razor thin in all those different states. It didn't take much to tip the balance. It was a coordinated effort, but that's a whole other subject. We don't want to get into that. Subject, right. We don't want to get censored now, do we?
I think we're already headed that way. But talking about another subject, there's again being church and state. Again, it's interesting, and we Archbishop Vigano has commented on how basically the church authorities who have been occupying the church, what he calls the deep church, have been just following the lead of the deep state of these people like this district attorney in Los Angeles. And so likewise, this gender confusion, this confusion of divinely established categories and roles has infiltrated, I wouldn't say crept in, has flooded the church. And so just recently, just last week, Pope Francis in St. Peter's Basilica instituted in a formal ordination-like ceremony, which had some vague references to the old ordination rites of lectors in the traditional rites of the church, a group of lay people, including women. And there's obviously two blurred categories here, right? One, the category, the difference between a priest and priestly functions and the laity, and then the lack of distinction between men and women, the divine constitution of the church that only men, because Christ was a man, right? An irrefutable biological fact, contrary to what people say today, and therefore he entrusted the priestly function to men. So here's just a brief look at what happened in St. Peter's.
We'll begin with the institution of new lectors.
Oh, so solemn.
That right
tone of voice of the
is
announcer. Oh my
a
goodness.
rite that was reformed after
I
the
didn't
Second
see this.
Vatican Council. It's been adapted now slightly,
With the masks,
as
of
it
course.
is now open since the decision of the Holy Father last year, not only to men but also to women.
So again, notice the progression. It was changed at the Second Vatican Council. He noted this, right? Now it's been changed slightly by Pope Francis to admit women, right? That each step, what he's pointing out, again, probably unintentionally, this guy, whoever this is each step then leads to the next step. So Second Vatican Council, which is actually untrue, it wasn't Second Vatican Council, it was Pope Paul VI after the council, in the name of the council, devastated the orders of the priesthood and change them all around. Then Pope Francis pushed the envelope further now by having women, and you can see yes, Chris is right. They're all wearing their new liturgical vestments, their new cloth mask. I don't think they're N95 though, so they didn't get the new memo that those don't work anymore.
Well, if there were the N95 during the ceremony, they'd be passing out and dropping to the floor.
Right.
You can't wear those things for more than an hour at a time.
So, and again, here they are. They will each, if I skip forward a little bit, approach Pope Francis, receive a Bible there, and again, you see all the lovely vestments there. I'm surprised they don't actually have like matching to their vestment color. That really would have looked a lot nicer.
By the way, is Francis wearing a mask?
He was not. No.
Oh, that's interesting. Why not?
Do as I say, not as I do, of course.
Yeah.
But interestingly, for those who, and I wouldn't recommend it, watch this unending torture ceremony. In his sermon, he talked about we have to avoid rigidity and rules. And then the first general intercession, another novelty of the Second Vatican Council, was to pray for the church that we remain true to apostolic tradition. Amazing. As he violates it. Right. Well, and to remind apostolic tradition, I'll just, before we talk about this a little bit more, read from St. Paul, the apostle. Can't get more apostolic than that, who wrote in the first letter of the Corinthians, chapter 14, verse 34, "Let women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted them to speak, but to be subject, as also the law saith." And he reiterates the same thing in his letter to Timothy, almost verbatim the same words. So that's the apostolic tradition. But instead, what do we get if I go back? If I can get to it.
That's an N95, by the way. That poor soul is making himself sick.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, here it is. Yep, that's the deacon. Let's go back.
Oh, so when the deacon speaks.
Oh, there we go.
And when she speaks, when these people speak, by the way, that's when they're most likely to expel the deadly plague. But that's when they take their masks off because it's
the virus knows time to wait. You can't come out now. But here's what we get now. That's what we get. St. Paul, what is he saying from above? But again, what do we make of this? Where is this headed? I have no idea. Could you maybe enlighten me? Maybe is this a step towards something?
Well, here we go again, church and state. So in the state, we see a loss of respect for the divinely created order. And in the church, we see what Romano Amerio called the loss of essences in post-conciliar thinking, which is a fancy way of saying the lack of any recognition of the difference between one thing and another, between a man and a woman, between a priest and a layperson, between bread and wine and the consecrated species, which are the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord. All of these distinctions are being obliterated. And now we have a pope who laughs at these distinctions. He calls them rigidity. He likens them to the Pharisaical masters of the law. And yet we have here the most rigid, dogmatic, ideologically driven pope probably in the history of the church. Is there anyone more intolerant of dissent from his personal point of view than Francis? I can't think of anybody. I mean, even Paul VI was man enough to admit that he had blundered. He spent the last part of his papacy wandering the Vatican halls, wringing his hands and weeping as tens of thousands of priests defected from the priesthood along with the nuns. And it was he who said that the smoke of Satan through some fissure or other has entered the temple of God. So at least he had the guts to admit that something had gone wrong in the church. Not this pope. The more devastation he sees, the happier he is. We're dealing with someone who's actually a destroyer. I'm not judging his subjective intention. Maybe it's conceivable he thinks he's doing the right thing. It's not for me to judge. But objectively speaking, we see now in the church the same dissolvent tendencies at work in political society, which comes from the rejection of the created order, and in the church from the order that God established. You know, God did not do a divine coin toss when he decided the gender of the Savior. You know, it was decreed from all eternity that Christ would be incarnated as a man, that the apostles would be men, that priests would be men. This is not a form of discrimination against women. It's a recognition of the difference in their roles in the created order. That's the way God wants it. And there's nothing we can say about that other than to obey what God has ordained in the created order and in the ecclesiastical order in terms of the priestly function. But this Pope, by this ceremony, is hinting at the woman priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
He won't go there. He won't go there yet, but it's conceivable that it could happen now in localities. Yeah, he'll probably.
And you're right. Yeah, it's the operative word. And let's look at how they got to this, because there's a pattern here. So Paul VI jiggered everything up and let lay people take parts in priestly functions. But he said only men, only men, only men. But then tolerated letting people start letting women do it. Kind of, okay, well, you're not supposed to do that, but I'll look the other way. John Paul II, same thing. Only boys should be altar boys. Well, I'll look the other way. And then it gets institutionalized. And then now Francis turns it into not just, well, we're kind of looking the other way while you do this. We're going to formally, in St. Peter's, give you this office, install you in this office. Same thing with communion in the hand, right? Not allowed, against law. Well, we'll just grant some exceptions. Well, you can try it out. Well, then it turns into, as we've seen particularly in the COVIDian tyranny, this is the only way that's permitted to receive communion. So I think you're right. Isn't it likely this is the signal? Go ahead, start letting women act like deacons, dressing up, be deacons, letting them do more priestly things, and then eventually we'll regularize it with a ceremony.
Well, it probably will begin happening in places like Germany, and then we'll see whether he does anything to stop it. But yeah, John Paul II and Paul VI unleashed these tendencies, and this Pope is going to bring them to a fitting conclusion. And the drearily predictable result will be further decline in the Novus Ordo establishment, a further emptying of the pews, closing down churches, closing down schools. They're on a suicide mission, and they're calling it a renewal. This is the perversity this is the perversity at work. As the patient dies, the doctor says more of the same treatment. They're determined to kill the patient.
I mean, it's like the absurd of build back better. You're doing the opposite of what your phrase suggests you're doing. No, it's true. Well, actually, maybe to put these stories together, maybe the plan is they'll just get a bunch of women who identify as men and say, "Oh, well, you should ordain us." That's their first step.
Women, man, what's the difference? So this is what we're seeing in the church, and every one of these discussions, we have shown that as the church goes, so goes the world.
Yes.
And there's a relationship between the states of each of the commonwealths, the ecclesial commonwealth and the civil commonwealth. So the disorders in society reflect disorders in the church, which reflect disorders in society. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. What the church should be doing, and I made this point at a talk I gave in Florida, is standing up against this tide, this corrosive tide of rebellion against the divine law. And I pointed out that, for example, with the COVID tyranny, if the bishops had stood up as one, or even half of them had stood up as one and said, you're not closing our churches. We will not shut down divine worship. We will be at our cathedrals, inviting everyone in for a normal Sunday Mass, even if it's the Novus Ordo. And if you want to arrest me, come and get me and put the handcuffs on me. Nothing would have happened, and that would have been the end of it. The whole tyrannical regime of trying to shut down churches would have ended that day, because nothing could have been done if the bishops had stood up. Instead, they cowered and went along with the demands of the state as basically toadies for secular power, which is not what the church is supposed to be. The church is supposed to be a sign of contradiction. Now
Well,
it's
and
a sign of acquiescence.
likewise within the church, if the bishop stood up and said, Francis, keep your little right of not in my diocese, your traditionis custodes, suppression of Latin Mass, not in my diocese. And again, you wouldn't need complete uniformity, but if you had a substantial number of bishops come together and just say no, what's he going to do?
Well, there's some
I mean,
hope there. There's some hope there, I think, because even
yeah.
if they don't stand up and say it openly, I think they're just quietly in many places going to ignore this and wait for him to die, which can't be too far in the future, because after all, even if he's totally healthy, he's 84, 85 years old. So I'm sure a lot of bishops are figuring, and I've seen this in many places, I'll do nothing, because I'm certainly not going to uproot this thriving parish that's sending me boatloads of money. Just because Francis has a sense of irritation about certain traditionalists, which was the whole reason for this ridiculous document with this petty motivation.
Yes.
You annoy me, so I'm going to take away the immemorial right of Mass. These are the actions of a petty dictator, not a pope. But again, church and state, the relationship is clear.
It is. Well, and again, what can we do about it? Just return to first principles, right? Because sometimes you can think, it's like being in an insane house. When you're sane, you start thinking, wait, am I the crazy one? Just remember, men are men, women are women, priests are priests, lay people are lay people, right? Keep these categories straight in our own mind, teach our children the difference, and wait for Our Lady to save us, as she's promised. She will. She's our last hope, and if we turn to her and let her place her mantle over us, we don't have to worry about it, because this man, protesting in California, declaring himself a woman, changes nothing about reality. God is still God. He's still a man, and the insanity of their little temper tantrums will eventually be shown for what they are. So I think we just keep that hope and keep praying to Our Lady.
I can say that even though we are in an insane asylum, I never for a moment was tempted to think that I was the crazy one. I always knew that they were nuts. Of course they're nuts. But you're right. If we just keep the faith and try to get others to become Catholics and increase the size of the number of the elect in the mystical body of Christ, then the social problems will take care of themselves. The church is the leaven of society. Then the church will not be defeated. There's still places in the United States and elsewhere where the traditional faith is being passed on. And Francis can do nothing in the end to stop the growth in those places of the true church, the church of all time and the Mass of all time.
Yes. Well, there you have it. That's our view. We'll, as sponsored by the Fatima Center, we hope you've enjoyed this issue of Church and State, and we'll see you in another couple of weeks to see what more surprises the deep state and deep church have for us. So,
if we're still on YouTube by then.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris. We'll see you again soon.
Take care.